So the reason for this talk is that I have a new book out called Too Much Fun: The 5 Lives of the Commodore 64. And just to give a bit of background for who I am. So as was said, I'm basically a video game theorist. So previously to this, I've written 4 books about video games. So one about the meaning of rules and fiction in games, one about the meaning of small games, one about, as was just mentioned, the pain of playing video games, so the question of why do we play video games even though they make us unhappy so much at the time. And previously to this, Handmade Pixels about the rise of independent and experimental games. And now we get to my latest book, Too Much Fun, about the Commodore 64, which is a slightly different book. So this is a book about a computer, but of course about a computer that was famous for its games. And so this is, in a way, I think you might say the default complete setup of a Commodore 64. And so I wrote this book because the Commodore 64 was my first computer. So it's a computer which the steps I've traversed. I tried to exploit all the quirks of its chips. I spent a lot of time writing demos or graphical demonstration programs to show off my skills. I met with other people. I went to demo parties. I slept on the hardwood floors of school auditoriums. I also programmed kind of small games with myself and for my friends, and sort of participated in a larger culture around the machine, right? And so when I wrote this book, at first I was thinking that should be the main focus, right? This kind of intense relation to the computer. But then while talking to a lot of different people, I realized that different people just had very, very different ideas about what the Commodore 64 was and very different relations to it. And so it became clear that kind of had to be the focus on the book, right? The fact that this kind of now simple machine that was largely unchanged actually could mean a lot of different things to different people. And so the fully stocked machine like this, if you actually use the Commodore 64 a lot, there's a kind of body memory that kicks in, right? So you know what it's like to tap the keys. Remember the sound of the keys, for example. You know what it's like to open a game with like a kind of elaborate drawn cover, and to take out the manual and take out the little tape that goes into the cassette. And you might have this experience of having these kind of floppy disks with little sleeves, and then writing on the sleeve what games, in this case, obviously pirated games, were on the disk. And so you might even have done this thing where, in order to use the backside of the disk, you'd like learn to cut a little hole in the floppy disk so you could kind of turn it around. And so to me, I think that's actually, when people talk about the Commodore 64, that's often what it's about, this kind of body memory of the things you've done, right? It's also something that whenever you turn on your Commodore 64, and this is an emulator, of course, what you get is this default dark blue screen with the light blue text and the light green border. And so the Commodore 64 has these very nice things. You can ask it to do kind of simple math like this. You can, of course, do little programs like this, which everybody did like all the time. You can the Commodore 64 has this nice screen editor, so you can actually draw little things pretty easily on the screen. You can even change the color, so you can do little things like this. And so the Commodore 64, in a way, is kind of very friendly. So it's very open for you, towards you quickly making things, drawing things, quickly making programs, and so on. So one thing about the Commodore 64 is also that it's officially the best-selling home computer of all time. So what does that mean? So, and during the 1980s, there was a kind of idea that there would be professional computers, like perhaps personal computers, and then there would be this other thing called home computers. Of the home computers, the Commodore 64 sold probably around 12.5 million units, which is twice as many as, say, the Apple II or the ZX Spectrum or the kind of Commodore Amiga. And I think what's weird to me is often when you read computer history, that's not super clear, right? So often computer history gets reduced to, say, Apple and Microsoft with a footnote about IBM or something like that, right? So, but actually the Commodore 64 was the kind of best-selling computer of that time, right? It's also the computer that for a long period of time, from 1985 to 1993, was the platform, including with console, it was the platform with the most games, right? So this was the largest game library during like almost 10 years, right? And again, like if you read video game history, it's kind of striking that most video game histories barely mention it, or at least they tend to focus, say, 95% of the attention to consoles for some reason, right? And I was thinking perhaps when I was writing this that first that this is very different from my own personal experience. So growing up in Northern Europe, definitely the Commodore 64 was the dominant game platform of the time. And I basically did not know anybody who had a home console in the 1980s. It wasn't a thing. And so at first I thought that it might just be that the US experience was kind of very different from the European experience. Well, the funny thing is then that if you go back and look at the literature, for example, there's a paper by Chip Morningstar and Randy Farmer who talks about when they were making Habitat in 1985 in the US, the Commodore 64 was the mainstay of the recreational computing market, right? So, well, all right, that's actually different from what you might expect. Similarly, like here's a 1986 graph from DataQuest, which shows the Commodore as being the dominant home computer manufacturer. So what actually is the case here is that I think even, of course, there's a difference between, say, North American and European computer history, but especially the North Americans seem to actually have forgotten their own history, right? And we can also see this in Mad Magazine. So not only in terms of, say, units sold, but also in terms of cultural mindshare. There's a 1985 Mad Magazine spoof of computer companies, which makes fun not of, say, IBM or Steve Jobs, but of Commodore here called Commode. And the character kind of parodied here is Jack Tramiel, head of Commodore, right? So, and showing this kind of cultural mindshare that Commodore also had at this time, right? And also it makes fun of Commodore's reputation for making sort of overpriced kind of game machines, right? And so the timeline for this is this actually, which is that the Commodore 64 was launched in 1982. And at this point, it was pretty new for people to have computers in their home, right? We usually say that started in 1977, right? So it wasn't so clear how long a computer would last. The Commodore 64 was launched in 1982. And actually, even just a year later, Ken Williams of Scherer said that Commodore had plans to discontinue the Commodore 64 in December 1983, which didn't happen. So actually, the Commodore 64 was produced until Commodore shut down in 1994. And so that kind of is the question, right? So that is, given that the Commodore 64 didn't change, it wasn't upgraded, it didn't get new abilities, how could it actually be so many different things to so many different people for so long? And to get to that, so let's first think about just what happened just before the Commodore 64 came out. So in kind of Commodore history, there's a famous meeting in 1980 in London with the Commodore executives and top engineers in London. And this is Jack Tramiel, CEO of Commodore, and this is Chuck Peddle, one of Commodore's engineers and the main designer of the 6502 chip, which also went into the Commodore 64 and lots of other computers. And at this meeting, Commodore was uncertain about the direction of the company. Should they be making more business machines or should they be making kind of more mass market machines? And according to the history, Jack Tramiel kind of pounded the table and made the call that Commodore would be making mass market machines very cheaply, which gave a lot of sort of consolation for some of their engineers. And so first, Commodore was launching this machine, the VIC-20, the predecessor to the Commodore 64, and later the Commodore 64 itself. And so when the Commodore 64 was designed, Al Sharpenshire, the engineer, was was making a video chip for video game machines, right? And how do you make a video game chip in 1981? Right. So the first thing people did was they actually looked at the existing games of the time. We know actually the engineers went out, say, to lunch and played arcade games. And at this time, arcade games worked like this. So typically you had some kind of background, which consisted of these little characters or like tiles. And then you had some moving objects on top of those backgrounds. And these kind of games typically concern whether these two objects bump into each other or not. Like, does an object bump into another object, or does it bump into, say, the background? And in a game like Rally X here, the background also scrolls, right? You can move around a larger world. And so these kind of games, or the inspiration of these games, led to a certain number of design decisions. You have these kind of character graphics. You can move those around pretty quickly. You have these sprites, which are placed on top of the character graphics. And then you have various kind of hardware facilities for moving the screen smoothly around. And so to be a bit more detailed, the way it looks is like this. So there's a background color. Then there's a text layer, and which you can redefine the little characters. Then there's a sprite layer, which has these little 8 little moving objects that you could place around the screen. And then you have this border around the kind of areas of the visible kind of screen. And the border actually becomes kind of surprisingly important at the end. And so then the thing you can do is then to look inside the machine and think about, well, what was this machine for? And when you look at it, then you realize that actually people didn't necessarily agree about what the individual components were for. So the video chip, which I was just talking about, was originally a project for making chips for video game machines, not for computers, right? The 6510, which is part of the 6502 family, the CPU, was actually originally not envisioned to be useful for computers. It was envisioned to be useful for, say, controlling systems or sprinklers or things like this. The sound chip, the 6581, was actually originally designed for synthesizers. So which means that none of the main chips were actually destined to be part of a computer. And so the computer consists of many different ideas about what it should be doing and what it's for. And so how can we talk about this? So the way I do go about it in the book is to talk about this idea of imaginaries. So the idea of the imaginary is to say that of course, prior to actual space travel, people were thinking about space travel. Prior to computers, people were thinking about computers. Prior to actually having a computer, people were being exposed to these various ideas about what a computer might be. And so this is to say that when people design technology or design media, this is often or almost always based on some imaginary idea of a future in which that technology exists. And so that helped me understand a bit better like what it is that something like the Commodore 64 can do. And to realize that in a way, if you talk to different people, the Commodore 64 actually means very different things, right? So if you ask, what is the Commodore 64? Both different people and at different times, people would have different answers to this, right? So the Commodore 64, in my estimation, has 5 lives. So the first life is the life as a serious computer teaching the basic programming language. The second life is as an arcade game machine. The third life is as a machine for a kind of computing subculture, which we call the demo scene. The fourth life is the life where the Commodore 64 feels old and it has to catch up, keep up with newer machines. And the fifth life is where we are now, where it's kind of an eternal style, that the limitations of the machine are suddenly kind of fascinating and not a problem anymore. So let's talk about the first life. In this imaginary, so the Commodore 64 is a universal computer for the whole family, for business and for education. It's part of the basic programming language tradition, which comes from John Kemeny at Dartmouth College. It's part of this tradition where you could buy, say, a book with basic computer games, and you could then type in this entire programming into your computer. In this case, the lunar landing game. And so, in a way, BASIC was always like a kind of game platform to itself. It's also such that when you open the manual, I also have one here, the one that comes with the computer. It's interesting. It starts saying like how important the computer the computer is, but then it goes very quickly into explaining that you can use the Commodore 64's facilities for making your own games. And just to show a bit why is that like? So this is like a small basic program that shows a balloon. And then you can see that balloon here is actually something that exists, something in the world separately from the characters of text that you place. So this is why it's kind of pretty easy at this point to do something like a maze and have an object move around it. And it's very easy to check if, let's say, like the balloon has collided with the maze or with other objects and so on. But this also posed a problem, right? Because people and manufacturers were kind of worried about games. So Apple, for example, in 1985, denied, John Scully from Apple denied that Apple were making home computers. And they asserted that they were making computers for the home instead. And so, like, you have to pass this, like, what does this actually mean? So the point was that Apple didn't want to be associated with home computers, which were assumed to be cheap machines that you could play games on. Apple with the Apple II wanted to be much more serious company. And so this was like, I think this is from the title of Too Much Fun for the book, is that people were generally worried about being associated with games and having their computer being seen as a game computer, which would make it much more difficult for, say, parents to justify buying it. And so Commodore often, when they promoted the Commodore 64 in the beginning, would start by mentioning how serious the Commodore 64 was, that it has word processing and databases and electronic spreadsheets. And then there might be, and by the way, it also has games. But clearly, games were not the primary selling point when it was being promoted. And so he's a kind of common quote, somebody explaining that they wouldn't be able to convince the parents to get a kind of console, but you could convince them to get a Commodore 64. And so that, I think, pretty quickly became the dominant imaginary, the idea of what is the Commodore 64. It became an arcade game machine, right? And so at first, a machine for allowing you to play those arcade games at home. And then gradually, when people started getting used to this idea that, well, if you're playing at home, you don't need just 3 lives, you can have more and so on. Then it also became a machine for going beyond the arcade. And just to give you a sense of some of the kind of famous games, so Summer Games was famous for this kind of very elaborate opening ceremonies of a kind of Olympics style kind of setting, and all these different disciplines. In the International Karate was a really good arcade karate game. Monty on the Run has this kind of wonderful music. SimCity was originally done on the Commodore 64. And then you have some kind of very strange games. So there's a Frankie Goes to Hollywood game based on this kind of 1980s synth pop band. And you have weird UK games like this Bozo's Night Out, which is basically a game about getting drunk and then having to kind of find your way home, right? I think often what you can see happening is that when console manufacturers were trying to be very professional with, say, official quality seals and things like this, home computer games could afford to be kind of really weird and strange because there was nobody to kind of gatekeep or control what was being made. Specifically, I think there's a long, this kind of Commodore 64 arcade game tradition. So you take games like Matic Miner or Wanted Monty Mole, or again, Munchie on the Run. And so there's a specific thing in the UK, actually, that there's a lot of mining games. So under Thatcher in the 1980s, there were these large miner strikes in the UK. And that actually really made it into a lot of these games, even though they were also really deeply surreal. It's also a tradition that kind of later carries on to a game like kind of Turrican, which is much more sort of action and kind of shooting kind of oriented, right? But I think the tradition kind of starts with something like this kind of Manic Miner, which is sort of a based on these different screens of platforming. After a while, that becomes a scrolling game. So I said the Commodore 64 is designed so you can make a game that scrolls around a world, right? And so this is a 1983 Son of Blackguard, which to me is interesting because it definitely predates a lot of what people later think of as, say, kind of Metroidvania or Metroid or Castlevania and so on. So there's a very large tradition of these action-adventure games or action-adventure platform games in the early 1980s on the Commodore 64, way before like something like Nintendo did anything like this, right? It's also interesting to note that people just didn't really understand what this was at the time. So the manual for Blacker actually has this kind of explanation in the inlet on the cassette saying that this is a typical image area viewed at any one time. So explaining to people that you're only seeing a small subset of the screen because people weren't really used to that. And so why is that special? Well, it's actually if you look at it and realize a way you can think of like whole like early computer history like this. So there's all these kind of precursors like mainframe computers and typewriters and early boards and like the Commodore PET and the entire 2600. That relatively few the computers actually allowed for hardware scrolling. So again, people were worried about the taint of games. So say when the IBM PC was developed, it didn't actually allow for kind of hardware scrolling. So remember, it took at least it wasn't until the early 90s that the PCs actually had like scrolling games properly. And so the Commodore 64, along with the Atari 8-bit at this time, was basically the only kind of computer that allowed you to scroll around the screen. And I think that created a whole kind of specific tradition. You also had, of course, games in this kind of area. I think a famous game is kind of Impossible Mission, which is famous for this book, "Destroy Him, My Robots" sample when the game starts. It's also kind of weirdly modern. It's actually a roguelike, so the levels are randomized. It's also unbelievably hard, and I think this was really common at the time. That basically a lot of Commodore 64 games were probably practically not something you could complete as a kind of human. And so what magazines often did, especially in Europe, was that they provided these kind of pages with cheats. And so cheats at this time was not some kind of code that had been assigned. It was actually kind of a piece of programming. So you'd have to type in a specific poke command, which would actually modify the machine code of the game. So if there was a place where you got 3 lives, you change the number not from 3 to 200 lives or something like this, right? And so magazines, especially in Europe, were kind of very closely a part of this thing that on the one hand, games would often be too hard. On the other hand, magazines would help with kind of providing modifications to the program so they would actually be playable. I think it's a little difficult, so audio-wise for now. Just say that so Monty on the Run is also another game in this arcade platformer tradition. It has this really famous music by Rob Hubbard, and I think this was also was a very central thing on the Commodore 64. The fact that it had the sound chip, which is very close to sort of like leading analog synthesizers at the time. So you could hear this really wonderful music, and there was really this whole slew of famous composers, say like in this case like Rob Hubbard or Chris Schulzbeck or other people like that. And this also meant that music had a special status, right? So this is from SAT 64, the magazine. There's a readers chart where people write in what the famous favorite game is for the time being. But there's also a music chart separate from the games. So people would actually also write for their currently favorite music on the Commodore 64. And that would also be, say, people would rip the music from the games and you'd get floppy disks, the pirate with collections of music. So there was a kind of sort of AP3 tradition of kind of trading and swapping music prior to kind of modern day music piracy. I think also the legacy, of course, as we're probably going to talk about, is also as the first platform for a kind of graphical online multi-user experience. So by Randy Farmer and Shane Morningstar as something that was tied in this case to Quantum Link, which was the style of service. And so Commodore was also early in kind of selling modems, allowing people to connect their computers to not the internet, but to other computers, right? And so what's the Commodore 64 legacy in games? I think there's a few different things to point to, right? So SimCity was originally designed on the Commodore 64 by Will Wright, specifically to use the scrolling facilities of the machine. The Sims was inspired by Little Computer People. One of the developers of Grand Theft Auto talks about how it's actually inspired by an early Commodore 64 game called Siren City, which was also a top-down game about crime. The action-adventure game was a very strong tradition on the Commodore 64. The open-world game, games like Elite or Pirates by Sid Meier, and games like, let's say, from Habitat, the online graphical multiplayer game. So I think often this is kind of forgotten, but I think in the machine, actually, the Commodore 64, I think, has a very clear imprint on kind of gaming history. So Commodore US was hesitant to promote games, right? But the European distributors actually kind of got into it during the second half of the 1980s. So this is, I think, a circa 1987 Swedish ad, which talks where these kind of delinquent youths seem to be saying, where have you been out? What have you done? Nothing. So clearly, they're up to no good, right? And so the idea is that the Commodore 64 and playing games on the Commodore 64 is the better alternative, right? At least it keeps the kids off the streets. And there would also be packaged computer deals. So you buy a Commodore 64 with a Batman package, for example. And so that became the idea of the Commodore 64 as a game computer became much more prevalent in Europe than in the US. So this takes us to the third life, right? That people also started making this kind of funny, interesting computer subculture, which originally I think grew out of people would say grew out of kind of cracking or breaking copy protection, but would often then involve making these demos. And demos were pieces of program that would usually kind of illustrate some kind of trick that was thought to be impossible. So, for example, I've talked about that the Commodore 64 has this blue central screen and then this light blue border. So people realized that at around the mid-1980s that you could actually get around it. You could trick the video chip to forgetting to draw this blue border. And so here's the top and the bottom border is gone, but you would also do like this and then show sprites in these kind of borders here, in the side border as well, which is a little more tricky. So why was that important? It's just because every time you turn the Commodore 64 on, you're faced with the same kind of screen, the same kind of layout, the same kind of border. And so if you've seen this a million times, suddenly seeing graphics outside that is kind of really shocking. And it also became this kind of thing where there's a competition for showing as many sprites as possible. So this is one which shows kind of 32 sprites at the same time. And yeah, well, this is shows a bit like when the computer is doing the work to show these sprites. So the demo scene became this kind of competition for finding new kind of weird tricks on the Commodore 64. And so one of the things, so one of the things that happened was that there was this whole subculture around it. So this is from a demo party in 1989, the Upfront Trilogy Dominators Party, and you can see there are several hundred young people, mostly young men, just in the late teens or early 20s, meeting up to program and to do a demo competition. So this was in a way both kind of subversive and kind of very well organized. This is actually me, and so as you can see, almost nothing has changed since then. So what you do is you submit a demo to the party and then show it to other people, and then there was a voting system. So this is the demo I've been working on, and this is like the winning demo, which kind of for every screen explains like why the screen is important. So this is a 32 sprites multiplex a disk, etc. Right? So that there's often these explanations for why this is technically interesting. And this other demo won, and we were only third. I'm still slightly bitter, but I accept the votes. I think it makes sense, right? But it's interesting to me that this was such a central thing, right? That there was a large subculture around this kind of weird, not weird, or at least kind of very technical computing, but also computing for its own sake and computing with your friends and just kind of competing with your peers. And it's also then interesting to look at the current the databases we have of these things. We can see that of all countries, Germany was the one that seemed to be the origin of most kind of cracked software. You have a few other countries that stand out: the US, UK, Sweden, Netherlands, Denmark. And in terms of like the number of demos produced, you can see that Germany again is the biggest country. US was not a very big demo producing country as far as we know. We can see also compared to the size of the country, then actually Denmark and Netherlands and Sweden are the ones with the kind of most demo activity. This takes us to the fourth life, keeping up with the future. So after a while, then the computer started to feel old, right? So there's a feeling that there were newer machines, typically the PCs or especially the Commodore Amiga. And to kind of make the Commodore 64 keep up, then there's all this work in doing things like graphical interfaces, for example, GIOs, as this review also talks about. Finally, as allows you to have like icons and windows and pull down menus, all the things you didn't actually have on the Commodore 64 usually, and so the Commodore 64 would be made to sort of keep up with newer computers. We could also see that, so when a popular game like the Amiga game Lemmings on the left came out in 1991, there was all this kind of anticipation about whether there would be a proper Commodore 64 version of it. And so people understood that this was not something that would actually live up to the Amiga version, but people were hoping that it would be, say, surprisingly good, as the review in this case said. Still at this time, there were like many things kind of going on. People were still making demos, things like this. I should also show you. I'm just sure there's another demo. There's a famous one called Memento Mori, and so gradually, people would then sort of try to make demos which were a bit more based on a kind of experience, not so much based as explicitly on a technical trick, but a bit more based on trying to make a kind of coherent kind of narrative or coherent experience with coherent music and a graphical style or a theme that kind of goes all the way through. And so this is an example of a demo which clearly does all kinds of things that you wouldn't expect the Commodore 64 to do. And so for example, you get something like this kind of very large graphical object, where you have sprites which are turning, which is obviously not something that the Commodore 64 has any facilities to do. So when you get to something like this, there's always kind of ongoing puzzle, like how exactly was this made? Because this is not the kind of thing you expect the Commodore 64 to be able to do. Also, you don't expect the Commodore 64 to be able to do this kind of double-layered scrolling, right? Because it doesn't really have two layers of that kind. And so that's kind of an ongoing thing that kind of was happening, right? People tried to do new tricks, right? This takes us to the fifth life where we are now, where the limitations of the Commodore 64 are now charming, right? So now it's actually an interesting historical device. And the fact that it has big pixels, so that it only has 8 sprites, it only has a specific analog synth, is actually something people find fascinating now. That this is actually something we want to celebrate, right? And suddenly, what for a moment felt like a limited device is actually now a very charming and wonderful kind of device. There's this kind of switch, I think, which often happens with kind of old technology. And then you can also see like a game like Lemmings, which people had tried to make in the best possible version for the Commodore 64. Now there's actually a remake which makes it in these kind of very chunky original characters instead. So now that we have gone beyond being able to make these really amazingly good versions of modern software, now there's actually a fascination with making an even more simple, and even more chunky than original software was. There's also an artist like Rachel Myers who does kind of workshops and art performances on a Commodore 64, and she likes to work with these kind of very chunky characters as well. And that's also a fascination. So now that the Commodore 64 can be emulated however you want, there's also fascination with the physical device itself. So LFD Creo, a Swedish developer and tinkerer, he makes musical instruments. For example, this is the Commodore, which actually features two fully working Commodore 64s, each playing different parts of a chromatic accordion. And then the bellows in the middle actually being made out of old floppy disks, right? Then we can also see we are really at this kind of point of resurgence. So there's these various charts where people will vote for their famous favorite games and demos. And right now, actually, the most popular demos, three most popular demos are from 23 and 24, like this year and last year. The most popular games are actually from 2022, 2020, and 2018. So there definitely is a sense that there's the best years of the Commodore 64 are no longer in the past. They might actually be happening now as people become even better at using the machine. And so that's the 5 lives of the Commodore 64, like the idea that, in a way, the reason that it could last so long was that people thought about it in many different ways. So it was a serious computer, it was an arcade game or a game machine, it was a machine for this kind of subversive computer culture. It was a machine that was barely keeping up with the future, and now we're in this eternal Commodore 64 style period where it's an interesting historical style, a machine that has certain limitations, but those limitations are actually charming now. And so that brings us back to this original question. Given that the machine didn't change, it wasn't upgraded, how could it be so many things to so many different people for so long? First, I think that the machine was designed, as I said, with many different intentions in mind, right? It was designed to be a weird control system. It was designed to be a synthesizer. It was designed to be a game machine. And all of the fact that it had all of those kind of intentions inside actually made it possible for people to use it in all kinds of different ways, right? It was also very flexible, right? So that it was up to the user to decide to not crash the machine. So you could use every single part of the machine in off-label ways, and nobody would stop you. And that allowed, say, the demo scene to exist to create all kinds of new tricks that were not obviously possible from the beginning. And it's also said that the machine had some various kind of flaws, say like the floppy drive was really slow, but then later you got all these cartridges which would fix it. So the flaws of the machine, because it was so popular, actually created this kind of market for add-ons. I should also say that I think this demonstration that you could keep doing things with a 1 megahertz platform also shows in a way that we now are perhaps in a pretty strange place where we can't expect our phones to only last 3 years. So the fact that you can have an old device that can even be produced for 12 years unchanged and still be used 4 years later actually shows us that it's possible to kind of keep finding new things to do with an old machine. You may not actually need to be stuck in this loop of planned obsolescence as we are now today, right? But I also think that what it teaches us is that we can keep finding new things to do with the device, right? And I think what the Commodore 64 basically taught us is that a computer can be fun and it can have many different lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was awesome.